Connecting with my friends, love it. Connecting with some sketchy guy that needs remote access to my computer, really?
We hear you. That's why AARP created the Fraud Watch Network.
If you don't think this is right for me when you think AARP, then you don't know AARP.
Well, welcome back, everyone, from break. It's my pleasure now to introduce our next segment. Those of you who were here for the opening this morning have already heard from Ellen Dunham Jones, who was our first speaker this morning. But for the benefit of those who were not here, I will give a very brief introduction. Ellen Dunham Jones is a professor of architecture at Georgia Tech. She is an award-winning architect herself, a board member of the Congress for the New Urbanism. She shows how design of where we live impacts some of the most pressing issues of our times, reducing our ecological footprint and energy consumption while improving our health and communities and providing living options for all ages. She is widely recognized as a leader in finding solutions for aging suburbs. She's the co-author of Retrofitting Suburbia, Urban Design Solutions for Redesigning Suburbs. She and her co-author, June Williamson, in that book share more than 50 case studies across North America of underperforming asphalt properties that have been redesigned and redeveloped into walkable, sustainable, vital centers of community, libraries, city halls, town centers, schools, and more. So please welcome back Ellen Dunham Jones.
Thank you. Thank you, Cordell. And so, yeah, I think I'm just going to hope and assume that most of you saw this morning's talk where I went through the whole variety of challenges, 21st century challenges that today's suburbs are facing, but were never designed to really deal with. And I'm talking mostly about the post-war suburbs. But this session is really to look at those suburbs much more in terms of the challenges of water quality, too much water and too little water. So really kind of zoom in, because obviously water has, too much water has been an enormous problem here in Baton Rouge. Now, I am not a hydrologist or a landscape architect, or I really don't have expertise in stormwater. My expertise is in urban design, but it's been interesting to me. I'm trained as an architect. The sea change is almost too trite a metaphor to use to describe, but the difference. My generation was taught you design the building to shed the water, keep it out as best you can, and then as quickly as you can, get it into that sewer pipe where it's the engineer's problem. And, that was absolutely all any of us thought. Since 2007 and sort of changing EPA standards and recommendations, now we are absolutely taught that you want to try to capture at least the first 1 inch of a rainstorm on site, hold it, retain it, if possible, reuse it, recycle it, and slow it down so that the metals can drop out, cleanse it. And only if you have to, eventually some of that might, enter into the sewer system. But so we're building buildings with cisterns underneath. We're building buildings with blue roofs as well as green roofs. It's a very, very different way of looking and thinking about things. So I'm going to run through more at the urban design strategy, and again, just focus on kind of prototypical suburban property types that are sort of dying properties that are being either re-inhabited, redeveloped, or regreened, and in particular the regreening aspects that are really trying to, I think, help us become much more resilient in the face of climate change. Because very clearly, climate change is exacerbating a lot of the lack of resilience that is frankly kind of built into much of our suburban models. So let's start with just sort of, so here's a pretty wordy slide, but some of the current problems that we're facing, I could talk about the water energy nexus. And how many people actually know that phrase? So a handful, but not very many. I'm not going to focus on it, but it is interesting to note that after irrigation, the use that uses the most water is the production of energy. So whether it's oil, whether it's gas, whether it's even wind and solar, I mean, in the production of energy, nuclear certainly, the production of energy requires generally pretty vast quantities of water. At the same time, the dissemination of fresh water, the drilling and getting to, the piping of fresh water, the treatment of wastewater uses an enormous amount of energy. So at times of drought, often that's also when the power plants have to close. We saw that in 2012. We're starting to seeing that in other parts of the country again. So, and in times, there's a built-in connection that is extremely fragile, especially because at the moment, both of those are highly centralized systems. And so you break it once, the impacts can be pretty huge. So at the systems level, we really need, there's a lot of folks interested in more district energy systems, decentralized, smaller kinds of systems that frankly fit very nicely into the size of, say, a new subdivision or retrofitting an older one. So the water energy nexus is one issue. Groundwater depletion is also a huge issue. We draw in the US about 20% of our drinking water is groundwater, and we've been doing that for so long that we are emptying our aquifers. It varies in different places. That, though, clearly in places like Louisiana is leading to saltwater intrusion into a lot of those aquifers, threatening the water supply. That's also then leading to subsidence, use of land. So, there's a lot of problems with this continued depletion of the groundwater supply. The other big problem, of course, is stormwater runoff. On the one hand, that old model, which was get rid of the water as fast as possible, contributes to a lot of erosion. You're trying to get that water zooming down through the pipes into the creeks, and it's coming out all at once. You get a lot of erosion and sediment coming in. You get then the fact that the runoff is passing over parking lots and picking up oils and minerals and all sorts of not so good stuff along the way is further contaminating the water quality in those creeks. Adding to that problem is that over 700 cities in the US have combined stormwater and sanitary sewers, which basically means during ordinary weather, that's fine. You get a little bit of stormwater coming in. It shares the pipe. It goes to the sewer system. It's treated along with the sanitary waste before it's returned to the river. But during a heavy storm, what tends to happen is that you've got too much water, stormwater, coming in to the pipes that are going to the sewer treatment plant. The sewer treatment plant can't handle all that water that's coming in. You get an overflow. They just have to open the pipe, and untreated sewage waste is going into the river. And they get fined lots and lots of dollars from EPA every time that happens. But it's happening very frequently. And that's part of why a lot of our water rates are going up because the cities are trying to deal with this problem. EPA now does, as I said, really emphasize, and so most states, they've all adopted somewhat different standards, but emphasizes the need for on-site retention of water, so that you are now required to have retain and detain a lot more of that water before, hopefully long enough that you reduce the chance of the overflow from the sewer plant. And that's doing a lot of good things for new development, but it really does almost nothing to fix the problem of all the existing development, especially sort of out in the suburbs. So suburban design in particular, as opposed to in the cities, has the kind of a couple of additional issues, I think, related to water. But, like the downtowns, there's the reliance on yesterday's flood maps, and obviously we are seeing more and more extreme storms. 1,000-year floods are happening a lot more frequently than 1,000 years, it would seem. We're also relying on yesterday's culvert dimensions. Before the Clean Water Act, in 1970, 72, it was absolutely standard practice to build on top of creeks. I'll show a lot of examples. I'm kind of amazed every time there's a story in the news about flooding, one of the aerial shots will often be of the local shopping mall and the water lapping up at the doors. Because an awful lot, the residential developers were smart. They built on the higher land. The older the development, the more likely it is going to be on the higher land. The newer the development, the more likely it's creeping into the lower lying properties. And so we have a lot of failing culverts that can't handle the increased quantities of water that are coming. And that's also been exacerbated by just over time, as there's been more and more development upstream, there are more and more surface parking lots, more and more impervious surface. You've just got more and more water trying to squeeze through culverts. Those fill up. Now it's up on the surface streets, coming just downstream and increasing the amount of flooding. So one other issue that we're seeing in particular in a lot of suburban areas, though, is that the water and sewer utilities that were built in the 60s were assuming low density and smart growth, and we want to see some densification at some of those nodes, allow people to lead more urban lifestyles, the lower carbon footprints, and all of that stuff that are more transit feasible. And frankly, the water and sewer systems do not always have the capacity to take that densification. Sometimes they haven't been maintained. All of our water infrastructure, most of it is pretty old, certainly in our downtowns, but even out in our suburban areas, we are seeing more and more counties that are actually having to turn development away because they don't have the capacity to really deal with them. So I'll talk about various case studies kind of in relation to sort of three categories. One could probably slice this in different ways, but I'm going to talk about those projects where the motivation for change is to improve water quality. That's kind of one subset, and there's a certain strategies associated with that. Then the projects that are really where the problem is drought and too little water, and then the projects where there's too much. So I'm going to start with this image, which I hope most of you will recognize, and David Wagner is going to be speaking after this session at the plenary. And Wagner Ball has just, I think, done incredible work in New Orleans of really thinking big scale of the kinds of big infrastructural moves that need to happen to really help New Orleans be able to absorb more water, and yet at the same time do it in a way that actually also enhances the quality of life and helps revive and boost neighborhoods. So the Lafitte Blueway is the retrofit of an existing canal that goes all the way out to Lake Pontchartrain, sort of from the French Quarter, but now really widening it, deepening it, allowing it to actually absorb much, much more water over time, and then also really having the Greenway be able to infiltrate a lot more water down and replenish the groundwater as well. These kind of big ideas and big moves are, can be absolutely transformational, but there aren't a whole lot of them. The Dutch do a lot, and I think that's also certainly where Wagner Ball have been looking. So let's see. All right, there we go. What if suburban strips like Florida Boulevard here in Baton Rouge, what if someone came up with a proposal to retrofit Florida Boulevard into something like the Lafitte Blueway that would still have cars going around somewhere, but that might actually sort of say, what if all those surface parking lots were actually designed so that they could also serve as bathtubs when they needed to, without damaging the property? What if there were continuous canals that actually could slowly infiltrate water, but also hold a lot of stormwater at times when it was really needed? How would it be paid for? Well, those are the same questions they're asking down in New Orleans. But at a certain point, when you think of the amount of damage, property damage that is done by floods like this, is there a need? And I ask this, I really just pose this as a what if, but because I'm not from here, I don't really know. And I'm not even sure if that image is Florida Boulevard. I pulled it offline. If not, it's someplace like it. But anyway, I think there's a real value in asking kind of questions about what are the big projects that we need? Because in fact, what I'm finding, and the rest of what I'm going to show, are not so big projects. It's a whole lot of smaller incremental moves. And I think there's a real valuable discussion to be had. I think both are absolutely needed, but which is more relevant, which would be more helpful in different communities is a very important conversation to have. So what I also wanted to show is, so most of these, the innovations with water are happening at the scale of the individual project. Here's a, I think, terrific project in New Orleans, the Bioinnovation Center by Askew Dumas Ripple, really, doing everything possible that I think a building can do about how to capture water from the roof, capture from the air conditioning units, bring it down into a fountain in the courtyard where it is run through some biofiltration flows and cleansed and can start to infiltrate back down into the groundwater. Lots of use of pervious paving, a lot of really smart moves. But my only but here is this is an urban project. This is right in New Orleans, in very urban place. There aren't so many of these out in the suburbs. Is it just we expect innovation to only happen in the cities? Why we need this in more suburban contexts? And there are, so I'm going to just sort of keep going. I want to posit that head. So, okay, dealing with what issues of, I'm going to show a couple case studies then, dealing with issues of water quality. And the strategies, basically, one of the more common and I think a terrific strategy is to daylight the culverted creeks. The more you expose water to sunlight, to UV, You actually improve the quality of the water. You also expand the amount of space, how much capacity that has. And it's really returning it to being a creek. You also often tend to increase the property values because now it's a much more attractive amenity than just a pipe underground that nobody can actually see. There are projects that are reconstructing the wetlands, and I'll show some of those. And again, the strategy in almost all of these is to try as much as possible to infiltrate that runoff as close to the source. Wherever those raindrops fell, you want to try to get them into the ground as close to where they fell. In one of the new tools we have, and this is to see if you're awake, I thought the poo-sniffing pups would actually get a little giggle or little post-lunch smile. Anyway, we do have some new tools in water quality. Why there's a delay. All right, so here. So this is an example in Seattle of daylighting the creek, the culverts. So this is not a dead mall. This is actually a thriving mall. Here's just the sort of end of it. Northgate Mall used to have, just an enormous amount of parking. They wanted to expand, but local environmentalists were still mad at them that when it was built in the 60s, they had paved over the headwaters of one of the 4 salmon creeks. And so it really sort of fell to the mayor to get the mall to do a land swap where they gave up this third of their parking lot. And so this has now become a transit center. It's bus right now. It'll be light rail in 2020. And then they gave up this portion, which has now, the culvert is actually still way, way, way down. It's about 15 feet underneath the parking. But they've dug out everything up above that, redirected the creek sort of on top of that, so they can still get some overflow with the culvert. But the creek is now daylit, and in this water channel, you can kind of see under construction how deep that is. It's really highly engineered. It's capturing the runoff from about 600 acres surrounding it, much of that parking lots, as well as highway interchange, so those sewer inlets are all sort of coming over. Where it gets cleaned and cleansed, sort of on its way down the creek. They've also built senior housing in the foreground here, market rate housing, and there's an IMAX theater kind of in there. But now, instead of just being a pipe in the ground, it's become this great amenity that people, there's the boardwalk, and people really enjoy watching all the birds and butterflies and plants in there. So it's one of the kind of more interesting, I think, very successful example of daylighting the creek and really improving the quality. This one's another not so different example. This was a failed strip mall in Minnesota. Whoops, there we go. So here's the strip mall, and you can see that not only the strip mall failed, but the culverts had failed. It had been built on top of a wetland. They had drained the wetland, and it was perking. It happened to be located on a major migratory bird route for purely ecological reasons. It was possible to get a grant to demolish the shopping center and reconstruct the wetland. They did that. I visited. That's my photograph of, they built a beautiful wetland. Well, what that also did was create lakefront property and attracted the first new private investment in over 40 years to an extremely low-income neighborhood. So you really sort of got this combination of the ecological sustainability of bird habitat with now new investment in a low-income neighborhood. There's been many more new buildings have come in sort of since we drew that in 2007. So again, reconstructing wetlands is not not an impossible thing, and it can have all sorts of additional pros that come with it. So this is another example of building a wetland. There was already some ponds there in this case. So this was a manufacturing site in a pretty suburban area in Wisconsin, and it's a suburb that never had a true downtown. So when the industry failed, they decided to build their new town hall, town square, and then remediate some of the toxic soils by really expanding what had already been some wetland into a bigger wetland. And then they got these artificial islands that kind of work like Roomba vacuum cleaners. So the islands actually are sort of automatically piloted. They roam around the wetland, and they're planted with these plants whose roots dangle, and as it moves around, the roots are picking up a lot of the metals, and the microbes on them are helping clean the water. And it's really it's just interesting. These are all sort of new technologies that are kind of out there. People are using. This one is, I think, kind of interesting. I'm going to show a couple. Minnesota, the land of lakes, its weather is quite different from Louisiana, but I think Minnesota, in some respects, its geology is also rather sponge-like. So, it's not completely inappropriate. And the watershed, the Ramsey, Washington Metro Watershed District, was very concerned about the degraded quality of the water in the lakes. There were lots of algae blooms, growing number of problems, fish kills going on. So they started with doing an audit of their commercial properties within the watershed and trying to see who were the culprits. So the mall, not surprisingly, with a big parking lot, was one of the leading contributors of phosphorus and sediment into the lakes. So the mall owner didn't have to do a thing, but the Watershed Authority got about $5 million in grants and did sort of 4 different phases of development on this project. They put in a lot of rain gardens, so instead of the all concrete and gravel tree island, they made, now this view doesn't show it, but the concrete curb does actually break to collect the water so that the water from the parking lot drains into the rain garden. And they also had a lot of tree trenches, gathering more of the water, put in a big cistern to capture all the roof water, porous pavement in various places, and then also a community education program to sort of show, help explain to citizens kind of why is there a cistern at the mall, and what are all of these projects. And they're infiltrating about 20 million gallons a year. That has reduced the phosphorus loading 60% and the sediment loading 90%, just off of this property. So they were pretty pleased with the results of that, and so then they started looking at the residential properties. So, Maplewood is 30,000 people. It's a fairly small town, but it's really the watershed that has been taking the lead on this. So in nearby Burnsville, Minnesota, they did a pilot project where they took one neighborhood as their control group and then another neighborhood. So before treatment, they had almost identical water loading and going into the sewers during rainstorms and things. After the treatment, you can see suddenly the control neighborhood is behaving as it used to, but boy, the new neighborhood is really not putting a lot of water into the sewer system. And what it really was just a series of rain gardens along the street. So again, the water district pays for it, putting in a rain garden, cutting the curbs so the water off the street goes straight into the rain garden. And the homeowner simply has to agree, will you let us put this on your property? And will you adopt it? You get to pick what flowers and plants, whatever you want in there. And they've found it cost about $7,500 per garden. But it reduced discharge to the nearby lake 80% in 49 events in 2004. So again, they were pretty happy with that. And so then they kind of scaled it up even bigger, went back to Maplewood and said, oops, I keep doing that, I'm sorry. So they took now 2 miles of streets and actually started thinking about, all right, we want the rain gardens are really effective, but we want to really make these living streets. We want to actually increase, we want to put in sidewalks, we want to deal with bikeability, walkability, a variety of things. So in this case, what they're doing, here's the old right-of-way. The streets were about 31 feet wide. Now they're building the rain gardens and new tree wells inside the right-of-way, narrowing the street to about 24 feet. Again, they give the neighbors, adopt the rain gardens, they give them a variety of flower packages they can choose from. And they have public art in some of these, but they're really building in that walkability with all of the sidewalks. And they found it's really been incredibly successful. 95% of homeowners do take care of the gardens, even after they've sold the homes. It's improved property values. These streets are really they have more value with the rain gardens on them than the streets that don't. That led the city to then adopt a living streets policy for the entire city. That has now, so this small city of 30,000 people has 700 rain gardens and growing. That has now also inspired rain garden movements in Kansas City, Lexington, Kentucky, Toledo, Ohio, a number of other places, kind of recognizing that this is fairly simple, incremental moves that have, again, that perform pretty remarkably well. So that's sort of improving, that's where the motivation was water quality. It is also helping very much with, again, reducing the amount of water that's going into the sewers. So what about when there's just too little water? You're in a place of drought. There's a lot of it. Generally, the strategies are, capture and reuse the water as best you can. You want to try to institute conservation, get people to not use as much water, and you can design landscapes, xeriscaping and things. And then most importantly, really, is, again, replenish groundwater. I mean, that one comes up kind of with every strategy. So the biggest and so far apparently most successful groundwater replenishment system is in Southern California. And luckily they started this before the rather epic drought that they're in right now. But what they're doing is they're right on the coast. And so they've been having not only problems with their aquifer, they've been draining their aquifer for years, and they also have the problem of saltwater intrusion, same as here in Louisiana. So how they're replenishing the groundwater is using treated wastewater. So basically, the Department of Sanitation got together with the Department of Water Resources, and so now as the wastewater that used to be treated and then dumped into the Pacific Ocean is treated and then it's purified through reverse osmosis to an even higher level of purity, and it's then piped to the recharge basins where it slowly infiltrates back into the aquifer and is helping to reduce the saltwater intrusion. So, and then that is the water supply. So on the one hand, it's gotten some grief, as this is an example of toilet to tap. That's the kind of media description of it. But it reduces the yuck factor because, hey, they're really putting it back into the groundwater where it's mixed, and it's super purified, and it's mixing, it's actually increasing the quality of the water in the groundwater that is coming back. It's really been seen as remarkably successful. They basically say, we're creating new water this way. And you know, they have been saving a pretty enormous amount of water by treating wastewater. 2 other plants in Texas are also doing toilet to tap, even without the groundwater replenishment. So this is happening, it's been happening around the world, but as far as I know, those are the 3 in the US currently. And it's, so the question of, you know, again, how do we replenish this groundwater? Now, in terms of kind of a suburban property type, this is a pretty remarkable example in California, up in Northern California, just outside of San Francisco. Park Merced is a very large apartment complex that was built in the 1940s, combination of some high-rise buildings and then a lot of low, sort of townhouse scale. So for the last 70-some years, every drop of water on this site has been going into sewers and piped away to a sewer plant miles away from the site. But this is called Park Merced because it's right next to Lake Merced. Lake Merced is almost dry. So it's been drained for 70-some years of all the rainwater that would have been flowing into it, and now it's in drought, extreme drought condition. So new developers have bought up the project, and they are now, the plans now, SOM has done some really pretty remarkable planning to make this an incredibly sustainable project by just about, you know, in terms of transportation, in terms of social equity, in terms of all sorts of things, but in particular, in terms of water. So if for, you know, they are trying to return it back to the original site's condition where every bit of water drains into that lake. So instead of going into the pipes now, they're simply, job 1, they're removing every single pipe. So every bit of water that falls on a roof, on the ground, on a street, will find its way into now a highly agriculturally determined landscape. So they're doing this while they're more than doubling the population. So it's going to be an interesting one to see. These are some of the early renderings where you sort of see a permeable pavement on a more paseo, not a driving street, but also now with the stormwater trench to capture and collect rain from the roof and then drain it to some of the farming and, you know, a lot of agriculture, urban ag kind of being integrated and woven into this very high density project. And this is one of the more recent, just I think last month, renderings of one of the new buildings that's about to break ground. I think 4 are just starting right now. So pretty interesting to see kind of how this one really evolves. But I think that removal of the water in the pipes and rethinking how we treat that landscape so that it can absorb as much possible water. They don't just want to have lawns. I've heard different kind of, I don't know, you know, it depends on soil conditions, but the average American lawn, if it is not aerated, you know, you roll the thing with the spikes on it and aerate it, it becomes just as compacted as asphalt after 20 years. So you get just as much runoff. It is just as impervious after 20 years if it's not properly maintained. And most of them aren't. So here in Louisiana, there's also some of these really interesting, I think, what do we do with the wastewater? Where should it be going so that where it could actually be useful to help us replenish our groundwater? And so I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, Luling Oxidation Pond Wetlands in St. Charles Parish is, I think, a pretty fascinating project where the treated wastewater is being piped directly into the wetlands to both help replenish and revive the wetlands, but also in the hopes that then that the wetlands are one of the best places for carbon sequestration. You've got so much biomass and living material that is just absolutely sequestering all of that carbon. California right now is the only state that requires companies that have emissions to buy offset carbon credits. Other companies, though, it's certainly voluntary, and so there's the opportunity to be able to actually, pay for restoring the wetlands by selling the carbon credits and using wastewater as one of the real strategies to do that. Again, a pretty interesting question. So now we get to the question of flooding and too much water. What are the strategies really when you have just simply too much water? So at a building scale, you build green roofs, cisterns, you try to introduce water recycling, and again, increase infiltration any way you can to reduce sewer overflows. In general, we're seeing really a shift from gray infrastructure, the world of concrete and culverts and steel pipes, to blue and green infrastructure, more building of wetlands, building of bioswales, using ecosystems and ecosystem services to do what they naturally do with water, which is kind of cleanse it and convey it. We're seeing also, I think, some pretty exciting projects that really begin to treat water not as a problem, but water as a resource. I mean, certainly, as I showed in the earlier example about, lakefront property, people are attracted to water. Water, when it's not a threat, absolutely enhances property values and enhances our quality of life. So increasingly, I think the opportunities to build stormwater parks that can take a bath now and then. They're designed to hold the water, but they might be beautiful parks during most of the rest of the time. I wish I saw more examples of kind of buildings and infrastructure really designed to take a bath. I think we need more of that. Then there is the discussion that still sort of needs to be had about, are there times when you simply start to plan retreat from, if there is too much air, too much flooding, too much subsidence, and those kinds of issues. So some examples. So this is an interesting example, and I know I try not to show too many examples from Portland, Oregon, because everybody rolls their eyes and says, oh, Portland's the exception. We can't do everything that Portland can do. They're too far ahead. But what's useful about this example is I think it actually points to an absolutely common issue. So this is not in downtown Portland. This is the other side of the river. This is one of the larger kind of, for Portland, a super block, big parking lot with office buildings. And so it developed, but light rail did just come on this street. So a developer has just built 3 8-story buildings kind of on that parking lot and has bisected them with green streets with lots of greenery. So there's the old office building, here's the new guys. And so the roofs of those buildings all have green roofs. They're collecting a lot of the water. Portland is one of the cities that has the combined sewer overflow problem, and it's expensive to fix that. So new buildings have to pay a very large sewer hookup fee. The impact fee, essentially, for hooking up to the sewer, in this case, would have been $1.5 million. Instead, so the developer built the nation's largest organic water recycling machine on his site so that he didn't have to pay the $1.5 million. So NORM, as it is called, the natural organic recycling machine, takes all the rainwater, all the gray water coming off the sinks, and all the black water coming out of the toilets, and recycles it in a very sort of natural process where the water goes through different soil and plant types, and each of those kind of cleanses and picks up different of the toxins along the way, and they display it on their plaza. So here in the sort of main plaza down there, you've got the cisterns with the clean water and then the dirty water that is kind of going through its various processes. The black water is only used for irrigation of the new trees. They're not making it potable, they're not using it for potable surface purposes. But it's an interesting, this question of we're seeing the developer claims that he didn't do this for holier-than-thou reasons, or, he did this purely financially because the cost of sewer hookup was really high. What's also interesting, this project, I think it's worth mentioning, because it is on light rail, they didn't build a whole lot of parking spaces. They actually built, there's parking because there's also retail on it, but they, for the residents, they actually built more bike spaces than parking spaces. So there's 657 apartments and parking for 1,000 bikes. And in the first 3 months, before they were 100, I think they were about 70% leased up, every parking space, every bike parking was already gone, and the car parking, they still had tons of it. So they've actually had to rethink, they're going back in and taking out car parking, putting in more bike parking. But it is Portland. That's so Portland. And so on this, the topic of kind of how do we charge for water, Philadelphia now has stormwater utility fees, and you are taxed based on how much impervious surface you have. A student of mine did a little kind of study of what if you also, though you did tax people, but you also gave them a tool to sort of, so they could figure out that if they put in green infrastructure, if they put in a green roof, if they planted some more, put in more trees, you'd give them a break on that utility tax. So in this example, a typical big box, might begin to actually owe as much at its impervious acreage. It could owe as much as $3,000 bucks a month, but if it did a lot more of the green stuff, it could drop that significantly. Well, I think it would drop from the $4,000 then to the $3,000. So, people are playing around with these things. This one I think is a really I so want this one to succeed. I'm waiting to see what actually happens. This is actually just north of Philadelphia, a 500-acre office park. I mean, when a dead mall dies, it's 50 to 100 acres. When an office park dies, it's 50 to 2,000 acres. This one is a 500-acre one, built in the 50s and 60s. And built on top of 4 creeks. Because, hey, we used to do that. You just put the creeks in the culverts, and that, you just assume that's not going to be a problem. Well, it's obviously become a huge problem. The low-lying areas have been flooding like mad. And so now they've set up transfer of development rights that allow the property owners here to sell their building and sell their and transfer their development rights into the high ground, which they want to see densified and urbanized, kind of they have a sort of new urbanist plan for how the high ground could be redeveloped. They're located right on a SEPTA commuter line, and if they got dense enough, maybe they could actually become a commuter stop to Philadelphia. So I think it's a real, and the city then will agree, is paying for demolishing the buildings that are being flooded all the time and just turning it into park essentially, but it's not going to have a whole lot of trails. I mean, they're really just sort of returning it to nature and letting it absorb their floods and be part of their resiliency planning for the future. So as far as I know, they adopted this about 1.5 years ago, and no one has yet used the transfer of development rights. I'm fingers crossed. Because I do think it's a useful strategy, but TDRs are pretty complicated, and they often take a while before they sort of work. Here's another example now of building a stormwater park. So somewhat similar to the last, getting a stormwater park, but this one is Meriden, Connecticut, a small town in Connecticut, built a mall with urban renewal money right in their downtown at the early 70s. We did that in a lot of places. We built suburban-style malls in downtowns to help the downtowns compete with suburbia. Those are actually failing at an even higher rate than the suburban malls. But this one didn't just fail, it flooded constantly because it was built right on top of a creek. So here's the flood, the floodplain maps. They finally just gave up, and it'd been vacant for years, so they've demolished it, and literally a month ago, they opened their brand new stormwater park. And so the park is actually designed to capture rainwater really from most of the downtown and be able to hold it in an event, in the events of major storms, and hopefully help the rest of the downtown revitalize with now an attractive green park at their center, and having solved the flooding problem. So we see in Atlanta, we've had some of the same problems and built an award-winning stormwater park. But what's also really interesting to me is how that the interconnection of pieces that were not master planned altogether, but have come together really beautifully. So the big transformational project in Atlanta right now is this thing called the Beltline. It's a 22-mile loop of essentially rails to trails loop. Started as a thesis project out from Georgia Tech, but it also has become part of a 22-mile arboretum. It will have transit eventually. The right-of-way has been preserved for the transit, but the funding isn't there. We haven't yet even completed the whole 22-mile trail. But Trust for Public Land was really interested in trying to help the Beltline get started. They were willing to kind of help get the first park kind of built along the Beltline. The Beltline had just gotten its approval from the city to be a tax allocation district, but it was still not really real. No one quite believed it yet. So the Beltline is kind of happening, is sort of muddling along in its way, with the help of Trust for Public Land. And then there's this, the city is also trying to deal with its combined sewer overflow problem. It's spending tons of money just because it keeps failing and sending checks to EPA. And one of the perennial sites that had been flooding happened to be right next to the Beltline. So in 1907, There was a lake and a creek and an amusement park. And the springs for that creek were affectionately known as the Fountain of Youth and the Ponce de Leon Springs. So this street became known as Ponce de Leon Avenue. And we're in Atlanta, we don't say Ponce de Leon, we say Ponce de Leon. So Ponce de Leon Avenue here, North Ave here, eventually, were to help people get to this amusement park and the lake. But then the city wanted more development, and so they culverted the creek and were successfully attracted Sears to build one of 12, they built 12 in the country, major warehouse distribution centers where they're sending out the catalog, from their catalog, sending out all their goods. And of course it was located right along the railroad. So Sears agreed to come in and they built this massive building on top of the creeks that had been culverted. And then Sears was there until the 80s, and then they were out, and this abandoned thing, the city adopted it as sort of City Hall East, because they only occupied 2 floors, they didn't really know what else to do with it. And then all of the land behind it was just a big municipal parking lot, and it was flooding like mad. The city was trying to sell this, and they actually, had anyone been to Chelsea Market in Manhattan? It's a similar big brick industrial warehouse building that's been completely re-inhabited with restaurants and little shops at the ground floor, and then every cool, innovative business renting up above, and some apartments. And the mayor went to Chelsea Market in Manhattan and said, that's what our city hall, our Sears building should become. And he happened to get the same developers interested. But they were not going to buy the building until the flooding problem had been solved. So the city was the city at the time was thinking, okay, we're going to build a big tank underneath the parking lot that can hold all that stormwater. That's been the solution for how we deal with stormwater. Just build a big $10 million, no, I think they were going to say that one was going to be $30 million to build this huge tank underneath. Then an architect and some local folks said, it'll cost less to make it open air, make it a park, make it a beautiful amenity to the city. And finally they went out. So here's the new park, and this huge stormwater retention facility. Jamestown bought the old Sears. They've made it into Ponce City Market, which is an unbelievable renovation with lots and lots of restaurants, hip businesses, and apartments and lofts for rent. Extremely successful. And then right alongside here, this is the Beltline, which is really kind of the catalyst for all of this. They even have bike valet so you can come in from the Beltline. So Trust for Public Land, this was the first piece of land they bought to sort of help make the Beltline real, to help make that, once it was going to be a stormwater park, not just a stormwater facility, they paid for that. That's triggered, and in all of this is brand new development, new apartments all coming in to what was really, and there's more and more coming. So, but it was really fixing the water and making it an amenity, not just this problem that you're trying to solve, but turning it into a really beautiful park that kind of allowed the reconnection of multiple neighborhoods through the Beltline, the re-inhabitation of an old building that helps connect us to the past, the redevelopment with new buildings taking us into the future, and the re-greening to connect us to nature. So really, it's a great example of all of those strategies really coming together. Even though it wasn't master planned, it was unbelievably serendipitous. Last example, in Normal, Illinois, there really is a town named Normal, Illinois. Again, a sort of, I think, taking a problem and really treating it as this great resource. So this was a 5-way intersection, just an enormous amount of asphalt, really ugly, very difficult for pedestrians to cross, and created an enormous amount of stormwater that was flooding some of the businesses nearby and creating problems. So they actually set up deep tree wells, brought in street trees with tree wells that bring the water down to a new roundabout. So the water comes from these tree wells to, they found an old cistern, they also created a new cistern. They then run it through little artificial bogs, sort of these layers are the bogs, and it gets cleaned in the process, not to a drinkable standard, but to a touchable standard. It's become an incredibly popular public space. Again, just people love to kind of, come, people are attracted to water, and then water also goes back and actually irrigates the trees. So getting a loop and a cycle there, that's pretty great. So, all right, last slide. There we are. I think, to sort of sum up, I'm seeing a lot of shifts in practice. Certainly from when I was trained in school, it's not about getting the water away. It's keep the water, store the water, reuse, infiltrate it, on-site or locally. A lot more interest in treating wastewater as a resource. And so I haven't shown examples, but there are some that are really trying to capture the waste heat, especially from the wastewater, and recapture the nutrients from wastewater. There's a lot of, especially for urban agriculture kind of projects, certainly the replenishing the aquifers and the wetlands, that just seems like such a really smart thing. I'm glad to see we're doing more and more of that happening. And in general, sort of bioswales and rain gardens instead of retention ponds. I mean, we all know the old model, especially in suburbia, was you develop a property and then on your lowest point, you make a dry pond surrounded by a chain link fence, and that's your retention pond that holds water for a little while, but it's just ugly. It doesn't add any value to the ecology or certainly to property tax values. All of these strategies, I think, are now leading to some shifts in policy. Some are happening, some probably should be happening, and some, I don't know, maybe they shouldn't be happening. So I put these in question marks. I would love to see a lot more regreening of defunct suburban property types. Every community that has a dead mall, a dead office park, what they want is redevelopment, but the reality is when a property dies, there's a reason, and often that reason is the market has moved on. The loss of middle-class jobs that can support that use. Often, it makes more sense to demolish, to regreen, to build in resiliency. Of the 1,400 examples in my database, only 2% are regreenings. We don't have the kind of financial and legal mechanisms mainstreamed to really help this happen. We need a lot more of them. I'm throwing out on the table, what if we had resilience tax credits for something like that? Some city, Prince George's County in Montgomery, has a rain garden rebate program where they'll basically pay you for putting in permeable paving in places or putting in a rain garden. Stormwater utility fees, we are seeing in some places, probably need to see them in more. One of the ongoing issues, every time we have a disaster, natural disaster, there are people pledging that, okay, we're going to try to make this into an opportunity, not to just replace the kind of dysfunctional, flood-prone property buildings and things that were here. We're going to rebuild better and more resilient. And yet, most of the time, we just end up building back exactly what we had. We seem to be caught in this cycle. How do we retrofit insurance policies that really can ensure more resilient reconstruction? I don't know the answer on that one, but if anyone does, I'd love to hear about it. And then I think we need to, I'd love to see more transfer of development rights being used, not just adopted, but at least adopted in the hope that they could be used from flood-prone areas, again, to really just encourage, give people more options for how they could actually move and build on. And so finally, in closing, I want to come back to kind of the question of to stop problems like this from happening again. The question is it going to be can we stop it only through really big infrastructural moves, or are we actually, which who knows where the money's coming from, or can we do it with smaller incremental changes? And again, I don't really know the answer. I just know that right now what I'm finding are more often the smaller projects. And so I leave those open for discussion. So thank you.
Thank you, Ellen, for that very interesting and inspiring presentation. I think it's I think the answer to your question is that we probably need both. We do need the big infrastructure adaptations, but there's a lot of incremental things that can be done. And one of the things you talk about in your book is this idea of a sort of incremental metropolitanism, as you call it. That's a topic for another day, but it's an important, I think, concept.